So I'm effectively going to take the last panel's discussion and turn it into a PowerPoint presentation. Like, that's literally going to be it. Hopefully everybody's having a great conference so far. We've talked about so many fascinating topics from robotics, quantum computing, blockchain, artificial intelligence. So I'm thrilled and excited to be sharing the stage with some of the people who have come from different walks of life and who share a similar vision for agriculture. But before I get into it, I'd like to give you guys a little bit of an introduction to who Headstorm is. So Headstorm is a consulting company that focuses on aligning business outcomes with technology initiatives through human-centered design, technology strategy and blueprinting, and engineering. We take great pride in our proven methodology in working with a lot of the ag tech companies in the space to bring some of that rigor and discipline to create quality outcomes in an iterative fashion. As you can see from the slide, we work with lots of different ag tech companies, but also sort of in the tangential space with supply chain, logistics, finance, and so on. We're headquartered in Dallas, Texas. We have an office in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and also in Costa Rica. As we start to think about the ag tech 4.0 landscape, most of us have had a front row seat to the astronomical growth trajectory in terms of how we've adopted that technology and how we're looking to solve some of the crucial problems in the food system. AgTech 4.0 has sort of given birth to precision agriculture or farming by leveraging technology and capturing and analyzing thousands of data points and providing the farmers, the growers, the ranchers, the information that they need to be able to meet their profitability goals, their efficiency goals, their sustainability goals, and even their livelihood. So it's fundamental when platforms and services start to tap into drones, soil sensors, irrigation systems, grain silos, livestock, you name it, and how they sort of aggregate that data and feed it into dashboards to provide the farmers those insights. And as we start to think about it, I was doing some research, and a recent IDC report sort of found that on a sort of daily average, the farmer generates about 500,000 data points. Now that's just staggering, knowing that happens today. And all this data that's being captured sort of sits, to a certain degree in the periphery of where it gets generated and where it gets created. And as we start to think about what's next for Ag 4.0, we know one thing is clear. It's going to continue to grow, and that growth is not slowing down. So let's talk about some market research, right? There's lots of study that's happened over several years, and all the studies project that over the course of the next 7 to 10 years, the IoT agriculture market globally will go from, I think it's about 11 or 12 billion right now. It'll sort of grow to 18 to 28 billion. With a compounding growth rate of approximately 10%. That's pretty staggering. And this growth sort of comes with additional endpoints, and these endpoints come with additional data. And this data could possibly sit in those silos if we don't decide to break those silos down and possibly integrate some of those components to create insights that wouldn't have been otherwise possible. That same IDC report that I was referring to earlier on also projected that by 2036, the amount of data that would be created by the farmers would increase by 800%. So, as we start to think about, us moving at that level of speed, and, I'm not a market researcher, so I won't necessarily speak to how accurate these numbers are, but one thing is clear. We want to make sure that we start to build some of those foundational components off of which we can take advantage of this growth. And this growth will start to emphasize a lot of different things. It'll start to emphasize the variety of data that starts to come through. It'll start to emphasize the volume of data that starts to come through. It'll start to emphasize the veracity of data starts to come through, and lastly, the velocity at which it comes through. And we want to make sure that when that comes to us, we're ready to catch and it doesn't knock us over the head. So before we talk about that, I want to address an unhealthy habit with data. So, Halloween is a few months past us, and I tend to think that a lot of companies, large and small, start to treat data like Halloween candy. You can never have enough of it. right? So similar to kind of how kids do it, you go door to door and you collect as much candy as you can, and you don't stop until you get to the last door, and you're forced to come back home. And they want their baskets full to the brim, all of that data, right, that they're collecting. And then when you come back home and you're getting ready to eat candy for dinner, you start to go through the scientific and very, very scientific process of sorting through that candy. You kind of figure out, okay, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to do, I start to sort it. And at the end of it, and very, very scientific, I have 2 kids, I have all the data that I need, very scientific. 70% of the candy that they put in their baskets, they will never touch. That's trash. And to put it in a business context, a lot of organizations collect lots of data. They collect, they pay for third-party sources, they pay for the IoT sensors, they pay for the cloud costs, they pay for the team that maintains and manages the data. And then to turn around and the business asks, hey, can we get this report or can we get this analytics? Well, that's going to be a few weeks. Well, that's not a fun conversation, right? You think about all the money that you're investing, and when your CFO is trying to justify the cost of the cloud spend, it's very hard to do that. So the moral of the story here is we've emphasized a lot on predictive analytics, big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, cloud computing, edge computing. But we've sort of kind of moved away or not emphasized or put as much consideration into some of the foundational building blocks that are needed for this technology to be successful. And those are some of the building blocks that we'll talk about now. So and obviously does not look like a block, but more like an iceberg. A lot of the innovation happens sort of at the tip of this iceberg. So you start to think about, lots of platforms and services creating next generation intelligence and using AI and ML, but there's very little consideration in terms of how that data is captured, how the data is cleansed, extracted, stored, how concrete is the governance around that data, and how secure it is. And most importantly of those all is how well do you understand the goals and objectives on the business and the end customer, as well as how they measure success. So those foundational building blocks sort of are the launching pad for the next generation technology that we've been talking about. So when we're thinking about what's next, it's about the foundational building blocks. So we have to take one step back to be able to make a leap forward. And don't get me wrong, I'm all about building sophisticated intelligence, for our farmers to provide, to effectively change their mindset from looking at historic data to more predictive data and helping them create that transition. However, we have to be realistic when we make those promises, and in terms of being able to provide them with the forecasting capabilities that involve statistical modeling and analysis that will only help them make data-driven decisions, context-sensitive, bias-free, right? So it's important for us to be able to help them make that transition. And that transition is important because what got us here today is not what will get us through the next 5 to 7 years. And I'm sure you've heard that over and over again, right? We live in a different time. We're experiencing different challenges. And as we start to experience these different challenges, we have to provide our farmers, growers, and ranchers with all the intelligence that they need to deal with these uncertain times. So you think about the limited resources, right? And you think about the growing needs and the sort of the thing that we've been drumming all along, doing more with less. Yeah, we think about farming operations in terms of the complexity of upstream and downstream players and how we need to coordinate across those different parties to be able to facilitate business transactions. The need for us to have more sustainable and more environment-friendly agricultural practices. And then lastly, being able to adjust for weather pattern changes. You talk about biodiversity changes and some of the other factors that go into play when you're looking to plan for your season. So, we want to make sure that we provide our end users with the predictive data that can help them make decisions to impact the food system in a net positive way. So that got me thinking about the theme for the conference, right? To shape the strategic roadmap for building sustainable, food value system to feed the world. And for us to be able to take a step in the right direction, we kind of have to look at how data is structured across that food value system. So this is a very rudimentary representation of the sort of the value chain and the data flow today, right? So the data flow today starts from the ag input companies, and then it goes all the way through to a wholesaler and retailer. Right, at each step of the way, there's data that gets captured, right? And this data today, some of the data moves with a fair amount of ease, and that could be due to regulatory requirements, that could be due to partnerships that have been created, alignments that have been gained over time. So that data sort of flows through fairly easily. However, most of the other data sort of sits within the walls that it was created. So as platforms and services are starting to exchange information, that information, it's happening in a very brittle fashion. It's very manual, and it's not consistent. So as you start to think about providing this data to the farmer or the grower, and them having to make day-to-day decisions off of this, that data is fundamentally flawed in a certain way. And when furthermore, you take this data and you start to report on it from a sustainability perspective, or if you're applying for certain subsidies or rebate programs, it further exacerbates the situation. So, when you look at just one dimension of that and you start to look at the entire value chain, that problem further gets exacerbated across all the different players in the market. So I sort of use the analogy of, we have a foundation for a single-story house, and we're effectively trying to build a high-rise on top of it. So for us to be able to facilitate the next generation of technology, we need to leverage more than the data that gets created within the organization. We need to figure out how to incorporate data across the entire value chain to be able to provide value, to be able to create intelligence that wouldn't otherwise be possible through the disparate data sets. And we need to assess our farmers and growers to be able to work smarter instead of harder, and be able to leverage some of the limited resources and time that is available at their hands. So if you look at the data flow of the future will enable companies to exchange information in a lot more structured manner. It will be a lot more consistent, it will be automated, and most importantly, it'll be secure. It'll provide visibility to farmers to specific attributes, right? So it's not about just opening everything up. It'll provide visibility to certain attributes that allows them to make those decisions and allows them to pivot if they needed to. Moreover, this data is relatively accurate to what is being represented today. So I just want to make sure that I'm clarifying something. I'm not advocating for more data, I'm advocating for better data. Data is extremely powerful, and we want to enable this data flow across the value chain, and we have to do it in a manner that's responsible and organized. So instead of turning on the data fire hose, let's create the data Bellagio's fountain, right? And make sure that we don't drown our users and inundate them with tons and tons of metrics, because that's really they're not looking to be a statistician. They're looking to be a grower and a farmer and live a livelihood off of that. Now, obviously, this is a pretty big undertaking, and it will require a lot of different companies and players in the market to be able to come together to really be able to move that needle forward, right? So to be able to do that, we fundamentally will have to rely on interoperability being the core principle. Now, I think Kent mentioned that they beat that horse to death, so I'll probably have to bring that dead horse back on stage. But really what I'm looking to do here is to be able to enable the data flow of the future, right? This data flow will facilitate the movement of data that's far more organized and consistent. This also serves as the foundation for a working agreement that companies can use to create innovative solutions and break down those silos to be able to put together disparate data sets. Now, to be able to facilitate interoperability, I've just created a starting sort of 4 or 5 things. This could be an endless list of things. But the first thing that sort of comes to mind is publicly available data sets. Now, each company is sort of reinventing the wheel in terms of creating a baseline data set. So these publicly available data sets would be the baseline off of which other platforms and services can build their intelligence. These would be robust enough to be able to serve the needs across the different globes. So you think about internationalization, you think about localization, these data sets would be able to meet those needs. The other aspect that you want to start to think about is establishing data protocols, right? So standardizing those protocols to be able to exchange the information so you're not putting burden on one party or the other to be able to translate that information, and that fluidity of the data continues to stay intact. The other component that we'd have to put together is data definitions. So data definitions are critical when you're exchanging information so that as each party interprets that information, they are interpreting it the same way as it was intended to. We also want to think about how platforms and services, as they're starting to build their ecosystems, can enable APIs. So it's not only about interacting with the data through the user interface that you've built, but it's also being able to do it through backend APIs and doing so in a manner that's secure. And then the last piece over here is something that tends to get overlooked by many platforms and services is good metadata and documentation. We want to make sure that we continue to document the way that the APIs are intended or the way the data is intended to be used so that the consumers of the data are responsible and they kind of clearly understand how they should be using it to their advantage. So just keeping that interoperability principle in mind, when you start to look at the data ecosystem, the data ecosystem, at least in my simple mind, is made up of 3 different components. You have data that lives within an organization, you have data that lives within an industry, and then you have data that lives across the entire value chain. Now, you have a great deal of control in terms of the data that lives within an organization. You choose what you store, how you store, where you store, and you have a lot of autonomy when it comes to making that particular decision. However, when you start to go to the industry level, you lose a little bit of that control. And there's just a lack of consistency and standardization at that level, and it gets a little more complex. And then when you get to the value chain, it's just the wild, wild west, right? There's no standardizations, there's no protocols, there's no agreed upon file formats, and it just becomes immensely hard, and there's a significant amount of overhead involved in transferring data across the value chain. So, what we'd like to be able to do is, as you start to think about taking on interoperability, it's far less complex to be able to do it within your organization. But as you start to kind of move towards doing it for the industry or doing it across the entire value chain, it gets immensely hard. So my recommendation is obviously to start small, start within your organization, and then try to gain that consensus as you move outward. Now, of course, to be able to do that, we need to have a few ground rules in place. Just like any other playground, we want to make sure that everybody's playing fair. So for that to happen, we need to make sure that the incentives for the different players are clearly aligned. This is important because when you're trying to facilitate interoperability, it's not about a zero-sum game, right? Interoperability can create a lot of value. It can help companies identify, different partners that can play off of each other. We also want to make sure that we put a body in place that will help govern and provide the oversight that's needed to be able to make sure that we're continuing to move towards standardization that will help the masses instead of building one-offs. Thirdly, we want to be good stewards of data and incorporate mechanisms that will help protect the intellectual property of the different players in the market, and also be able to comply with privacy laws in different parts of the world, because that's key and fundamental. And lastly, security is just instrumental in terms of how we move data, right? We don't want the data to get into the wrong hands, and we don't want companies to be gun-shy about exposing data, right? So we want to help them feel that this is the right thing for them to do, and for them to be able to share that information for the greater good. Now, for us to go on this interoperability journey, it will require many conversations and discussions, lots of different iterations, lots of experimentation. And as we start to look out on the horizon over the course of the next 5 to 7 years, we want to make sure that we put ourselves in a position now to be able to build some of these foundational blocks. So when the next wave of innovation comes around, we have the right elements to be able to propel forward instead of it having, sort of compress under its weight. So I'll transition to some takeaways. I think, as we've been talking about it, we need to start shifting our focus on building those foundational blocks and creating an environment where companies feel that they can build an ecosystem where everybody can play nice without having to give away their secret sauce, right? We need to start cleaning up within the organization and start to build that consensus outwards. And again, this is easier said than done, right? There's a lot of different challenges to be able to make those moves, and that kind of feeds into my third takeaway, which is try to think about creating partnerships within the ecosystem and how companies can come together to be able to build a platform where you can start to share that data and then you can add more to that platform. And you want to create these partnerships that are mutually beneficial. And this will be hard to do because if aligning incentives is not necessarily easy task. To do that across many different companies will take time and many different iterations. And lastly, you want to start to think about, you want to set realistic expectations when you talk about interoperability, right? You want to make sure that you start small. You start with experimenting with a few different companies before you sort of open up the can of worms and try to do that at a grand scale, right? So start small iterations, and over time, you'll start to see the maturity that you need in your data and the maturity that you gain through interoperability. So there are some few other considerations that we didn't get to cover as a part of this because those could be topics of their own. And really for IoT and data and interoperability to sort of come to fruition, there are some fundamental elements that also have to be coming along for the ride. Connectivity with IoT is key. Right, so as you think about how data moves from sensors all the way back, that connectivity is sort of the backbone through which it'll move. And we are not only relying on 5G, but we're relying on a spectrum of technologies to be able to do that. We've made a considerable amount of progress in this particular realm of things, but there's still a lot to be gained in terms of the different technologies and spectrums as I was talking about. The ease of deployment and how we sort of maintain the IoT devices is also something that's a little bit more desired for. So as we start to think about, when we go to 18 billion or 28 billion or how many other devices out there, if that sort of growth becomes unmanageable, then the technology does not render itself useful. And having a clear understanding of what the initial cost and what sort of the ongoing investment is also key to be able to understand the different dimensions of IoT. And then lastly, with that growth and that spectrum of IoT, we increase as I call as a threat layer. So as you have all these different endpoints, we have to keep security in mind, and we want to make sure that it's easy for us to be able to manage the security at that level and at that scale, and do also be mindful of any compliance requirements. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and I appreciate your time. I'll take any questions.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
You mentioned taking things in steps. You don't want to go from 0 to 100, immediately. Is there a danger in going too slowly?
I'm not sure if there is a thing as too slow. I mean, too slow would be on the innovation side. So when you think about, some of the foundational building blocks are not things that we have never seen before. So I think really the action item here is to be able to change the focus. But I think in terms of the relative speed, I think innovation is going at a much faster pace than the foundational piece is catching up. So I think slowing down innovation is necessary. but keeping the same pace for building those fundamental building blocks is key. Thank you.
Question in the back here.
Hi, I have a question. Ooh, loud. I have a question about interoperability.
Yeah.
I've been in healthcare for a long, long, long time, and interoperability is one of those things that have been discussed over and over and over again. How can we forge a sense of trust in agriculture so that we can have that collaboration, cooperation, and communication that's needed?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I spent a considerable amount of time in healthcare, so I do have that level of appreciation where we have finally made some headway on EMRs, electronic health records, and in the way that they get shared. You know, I think there are multiple different dimensions on how we can establish trust. I think first is kind of making sure that, you know, the intent is not to give away all of the data. Right? There's a certain part of your data that is core to your secret sauce, that is core to your offering. We're saying that, you know, protect that data, put it behind, you know, IP, or put it behind a wall where not everybody can get to it, where just your trusted partners can get to it. But today, what seems to be happening is we're sort of putting a blanket, and everybody wants to create their own walled garden. And if we continue to have that mindset, then we will not be able to build the trust. So I think trust will be built slowly over time as we continue to create those partnerships, as you identify companies and platforms that play well along and can support you, right? And ultimately, the goal is to be able to, you know, focus on the pain points of the farmer, right, or the grower or the rancher, right? You want to sort of remove yourself from saying we're the best soil sensing company, or we're the best smart irrigation company, or we're the best drone company. How is your technology, platform, or service helping the farmer? And as you start to identify other platforms and services that share that same vision, I think those partnerships will come together. And it's just a matter of time and being able to pull those partnerships together to be able to build that trust. And that sort of starts to grow over time.
Time for one more question. Anybody?
So I love your comments, and I love the interoperability. I talked about it this morning, but there's always the battle between innovation and interoperability, where whether it's a graphics card or a chip or an image sensor, the secret sauce is what makes it often better, but also interoperable. Mm-hmm. And it makes the product differentiated in the market as the one to have. Take NVIDIA or, you know. So how do you reconcile those things?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to you understanding, you know, what is your secret sauce? What is your competitive advantage? And if your competitive advantage is easily reproducible, then it's not really your competitive advantage. Right? So companies have to kind of think long and hard about how they're positioning themselves in the market and not feel threatened, right? Because today the threat is like, if I put my data out there, then there'll be a me too, and then they'd effectively be able to give away the same services that I am for perhaps cheaper or free or whatever that ends up being. So I think there's a little bit of kind of fact finding that we need to do internally to understand what is our competitive advantage. And if that competitive advantage does not rely on a particular pain point or a particular process or a particular way of thinking, of innovating, then, you know, it's just a matter of time before somebody else can really easily copy you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.